Hello, everyone. Before we dive into today's episode, I have some exciting news about our next event in the Talking San Diego series of live conversations, and you won't want to miss this one. On Tuesday, October 15th, we'll be welcoming Nancy Pelosi, the first woman to serve as Speaker of the House, and I think clearly the most powerful woman in American political history, for a conversation anchored in her new book, The Art of Power. Pelosi, the recent recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, has served for 37 eventful years in Congress. She will take us behind the scenes of American politics, reflecting on her vital role in shaping landmark legislation and navigating the complexities of power during her tenure in the House, including her leadership during the resistance to Donald Trump. For tickets and more information about this and all Talking San Diego events, visit talkingsandiego.net. Welcome to Talking Feds, a roundtable that brings together prominent former federal officials and special guests for a dynamic discussion of the most important political and legal topics of the day. I'm Harry Littman. With just 5 weeks until the election, Donald Trump shows no signs of trying to expand his base of voters. He is all MAGA all the time, and the undertones of racism and xenophobia that drive his campaign are coming closer to the surface. At the same time, his rallies nearly invariably feature a patch of 1 or 10 barely coherent free association discourses that even the most faithful could not hope to follow. Kamala Harris, meanwhile, spent the better part of her week trying to answer the criticism from the right that her campaign lacked policy specifics and that she had not been tested by unscripted interviews with the media. She used an MSNBC interview and an appearance in Pittsburgh to lay out the broad and fine details of her economic plan. Here, as throughout her campaign, she was atop a sort of high wire, aiming to embrace the successes of the Biden administration on one side while presenting herself as the candidate of change on the other. Foreign policy intruded on the campaign with a visit to the United States from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who more or less had no choice but to meet with both candidates. The contrast could not have been more stark, as Harris embraced Ukraine's defense and outlined a broader foreign policy vision rooted in international orders, rules, and norms, while Trump used the Ukrainian president as a prop and raised anew the conduct that resulted years ago in his first impeachment. And his supporters made no attempt to mask where they stand in the Ukraine-Russia war and the broader battle between democracy and autocracy, bursting into applause at the mere mention of Russian strongman Vladimir Putin's name at a Trump rally. To break down a week in which one campaign aimed to advance a range of policy positions and a thematic narrative built around the middle class, while the other seemed to be improvising whatever flew into the head of the candidate, I am really pleased to welcome 3 of the country's most prominent commentators, and they are Jen Rubin, an opinion columnist for The Washington Post and an MSNBC contributor. Before becoming a journalist, she worked as a labor law attorney for 2 decades. She's the author of the book Resistance: How Women Saved Democracy from Donald Trump, and a particularly good friend of this podcast. Jen, thanks so much for joining.
It's always nice to be with a fellow Boltie.
There you go. Class of 86. I wonder who came in first that year. All right. Stuart Stevens, a former GOP strategist, one of the premier in the country. He is now an advisor to the Lincoln Project and the author of 9 books, the latest being The Conspiracy to End America. Always makes me happy to say this. It is his first time on Talking Feds. Welcome, Stuart.
Thanks for asking me to the party.
It's an endless party here at Talking Feds. And Ali Vitali, how could you have a party without her? The Capitol Hill correspondent for NBC News, where she's covered national politics for close to a decade, including every major election from the campaign trail since 2016. Her first book is Electable: Why America Hasn't Put a Woman in the White House Yet. I am once again the only participant without a book to my name. Ali Vitali, thanks as always for joining.
Alternatively, Harry, you might be the only one of us who's sane, so that's good.
People do sometimes propose this, and I just think, oh my God, write a book. What an ordeal. So hats off to all of you. Let's begin in my hometown of Pittsburgh, where last week Kamala Harris gave a speech at the Economic Club laying out her plans for the economy, which are in substance a middle-class tax cut, tax increases for the rich and big corporations, more money for child care and health care, incentives for manufacturing. Sounds a lot to me like the standard economic playbook for Democratic candidates since Obama and Romney anyway. Is there anything really new or noteworthy here that permits her to claim the mantle of the candidate of change where economic policy is concerned?
I think there is. She's a child of Silicon Valley, not of Scranton. And I think her emphasis on entrepreneurialism, on capitalism, does mark her a bit differently. She comes up with some innovative ideas that sound pretty Republican, actually, like giving inducements to employers to build in factory towns, like giving builders inducements to create new housing stock, like expanding the credit for individuals to start businesses. Those have a emphasis on the private sector. And she made pretty clear she wanted to work with the private sector. So when she stresses something like reducing red tape in permitting, again, that's a signal to the business community that she understands what they are going through. So the way I have looked at it is that in some ways she's more progressive than Biden, and in some ways she's more capitalistic and entrepreneurial minded. So I think part of that is just a different generation, a different orientation. But I think it was a serious grown-up speech. And when you have some really good ideas that, frankly, a Republican could suggest, like doubling the number of apprenticeships or removing the requirement for four-year degrees for federal jobs, I think it's a way of saying to Republicans, you're going to have to think of another reason for voting against me because I'm giving you a lot of details and I'm showing I'm a pretty moderate, pro-business kind of Democrat.
The word to me that really stuck out in all of this is pragmatic. And I think the whole point of trying to do speeches like this is trying to combat the idea that she is some kind of radical liberal that the Trump campaign is trying to brand her as. And look, as someone who covered her 2019 and 2020 presidential bid, progressive was the word you needed in that primary in order to get through it, at least in theory. You ended up with the guy who owned the so-called moderate lane as the nominee in Biden. But for Harris, assuming this new role, combating that idea of the ultimate progressive is exactly what she's trying to do because she never had to go through a primary. All she has to do is this pivot in the general. And on an issue like the economy, yes, putting forward these specific plans give people like us the opportunity to pick through, apprenticeships are something that conservatives typically would espouse. I remember from covering the Trump White House that he was big on that, and not just because it was the initial branded phase of his reality stardom. But at the same time, I also think that it comes back to the idea of the Trump campaign can play upon the feelings of people who know they're paying more, who are questioning why they're paying more. And the Trump campaign will continue to try to place that at the Harris campaign's feet because they are the people in the White House. Kamala Harris's only job here is to say, I hear you, I feel you, but this is what I'm going to do to try to make it better. It's not necessarily I have to show deep change. It's that I have to show a little bit of economic empathy, I think. And pragmatic allowed her to do that and also shed that formerly progressive moniker.
Stuart, I see you're about to talk. I want to serve up something for you to consider. Those are her words, pragmatic, practical. And you know Western Pennsylvania very well from your work with Tom Ridge, including Erie, but a really important part of a really important swing state. Jen's sort of suggesting that pragmatic, at least, is a code word or a target to the business community saying we'll make things easier. And I was sort of stressing, I think, the other side of I feel your pain, and this is something that will give you practical solutions. What was your sense?
I think the race is not about any of this policy stuff. I think the race is about Donald Trump. And what she needs to do is go out there and be a reasonable alternative to Donald Trump, which kind of encompasses everything that Ali and Jen were saying. I think they're both right. These are sort of mandatory things she's doing. It's like being in the Olympics and you have to do like a triple axel or something. It would be bad if she came out with crazy stuff, like I want to confiscate all guns or something, you know. But as long as she doesn't do that, and she does appear as a serious person.
It's the music more than the words, sort of.
Yeah, it's the same way it was in the debate. If you watched that debate without sound, you knew who won. My theory of the case, not particularly original, but it's 47% of the country is MAGA, 53% isn't. Their job is to be as welcoming to that 53% as possible. Come in, here it is, and take away any speed bumps to keep former Republicans from not coming over to her. And I think they're doing a bang-up job.
I also think she is stressing the populism that Republicans have talked about but never really acted on. She talks a lot about going after corporations that exploit the little guy. That's a very familiar Democratic territory. But when she talks about price gouging, there may not, frankly, be a lot of there. But her willingness to stand up to big government, big banks, big pharma is a very populist and popular line. And what she's really saying is, you want economic populism? That's us. That's not the Republicans. They're the guys who are in bed with the rich cats. They're the guys who are looking to exploit you. Now, you can quibble about the policies. You can quibble how much the president really has to do with grocery prices. But I think that theme is a popular one. And rather than the business community, I think that populist theme is aimed at those people in Western Pennsylvania who feel like they are getting ripped off in the supermarket, who feel like they've been overcharged for prescription drugs.
You know, I think Stuart makes a great point, though. I agree with him. I think that this is not an election where voters are going to say, well, you know, I want capital gains taxes to be closer to 21 or closer to, like, we're not there because Trump is who he is. But at the same time, the Trump campaign has tried to make Kamala Harris seem as if she's an empty vessel who came in off the street and randomly ended up at the top of the Democratic ticket, while also then trying to tag her with all the baggage of being VP to a sitting president. Basically, this is the Harris campaign saying, no, if you want us to talk policy, we will absolutely do that, and we have it. But at the same time, there is something I've always felt that's a little bit gendered about the idea that a woman is at the top of the ticket, and oh my God, she never thought about it and she has no plans. The idea that she doesn't has always seemed crazy to me because she has been in the administration, and they have so many legislative accomplishments from the first 2 years of the administration. People can quibble with whether or not you should have done something on the Inflation Reduction Act. People can quibble with whether or not the care economy or various parts of an environmental and climate program should have been as prioritized as they were. That's completely valid. But this entire idea that she has no policy has never held water for me. And so, yes, I agree. It's not an election that's going to be decided on policy speeches made at economic clubs in the 11th hour of the race. But at the same time, if the Trump campaign's trying to say there's no there, the Harris campaign is happy to say, no, we'll dispel that right now.
So has she now checked that box? I mean, she has now gone ahead. In addition to this speech this week, she has an unscripted, long interview with Stephanie Ruhle on MSNBC, as Jen tweeted out. You do that in order to advance policy positions. You could argue, given the sort of political underlying point that all three of you are making, that that's a little risky or foolish for her, because why should she try to answer that charge when it doesn't really matter? At this point, do they consider themselves satisfied and they won't be doing the 10-point blueprints on unscripted national TV interviews, or is she still trying to answer that charge from the right?
Well, I think this is a lot easier when the other side doesn't have any policy. Normally when you walk into a presidential campaign, there'll be these people over here and you go like, who are they? They're like Supreme Court clerks, Rhodes Scholars, and they'll be like generating more paper than the Renaissance as far as policy. Those people aren't there in the Trump campaign, which is why they've been so successful being able to say that Project 2025 was what the Trump campaign was for, because there is no policy in the Trump campaign. I mean, for the life of me, and I think that's hurting Republicans down ticket. Like, what is the bargain you get when you vote Republican? What am I going to get? I'm going to put an end to like the terrible slaughter of pets in Springfield. It's reflective of what happened in the Congress. Nothing. I mean, is there any Republican who's running for re-election who is talking about legislation that they passed? I literally do not know one. A lot of them are talking about stuff they voted against, like the Infrastructure Act.
But they're taking credit anyway.
And they take credit for it. But it's just astounding to me that I really think that's a true statement. I don't know one ad that's been out there that somebody said, okay, I passed this, which is really just, I think, a sign of the complete collapse of the Republican Party as a governing party.
It's ironic that she's done a much better job painting him as the crazy pants guy, because he is crazy pants. And she did something I frankly thought was going to be really tough, and that is explaining to people in general how scary Project 2025 is. This is a 900-page document. I didn't even think they were going to get around to talking about it. And in fact, it is overwhelmingly unpopular because she has talked about it at almost every appearance. They made a big deal about this at the convention. And then on top of that, she's done a really good job debunking tariffs. I mean, it's hard to do these things. Democrats, Republicans have been trying for years to have these very, esoteric economic questions about free trade. She's basically said, this is a $4,000 tax on ordinary people. It's a bad idea.
And you know who agreed with her? Mitch McConnell this week, who never takes Trump questions from us at the Capitol.
Exactly. And that's the irony, is that she's more Republican than the Republican Party is now. If you looked at, not that she's some Reaganite, but if you looked at kind of the middle of the road Republican 15 years ago, it wouldn't be that different from what she's suggesting. But it's really where they are now.
I think that's being reinforced by foreign policy. That when she is the one who is standing up there with Zelensky, she's the one who's opposing Putin. And I saw this very interesting polling number, really jumped out to me, of who would you be more comfortable with as commander-in-chief, and she was beating Trump. That, to me, is very telling for a first female president to do that. And I think if the Democratic Party can continue this, it's going to have seismic effect on our entire politics for generations, because there'll be the party of strength again, which is always the Republican since Reagan brand. And Trump has just squandered that, and the party has.
And it's a great point. I think she mainly needs to fight him to a draw there. And, especially with all the denunciations by the previous foreign policy establishment who worked with him. I want to follow up this basic point that I think we're all agreeing on. I certainly do, if I haven't made it clear, that it is more sort of generic, and the figure she casts and what people would see with the TV off, except whenever there's a big national poll, I think people sensibly point us to, the microcosms of individual swing states. So I just wanted to ask about a couple issues that I think may matter for particular swing states. Let's start with, she's walking back her strong support for emission standards for automakers and her previous embrace of electric cars, which Trump is trying to exploit as a, elite coastal kind of thing. Do you think that makes her, is she vulnerable in all-important Michigan on that previous stance? What does she need to do there?
If she was running against someone who could make a sustained argument or even complete an English sentence, it might be a problem. But he cannot. And that's what's so frustrating. Although Republicans asked for it, this is what they wanted, this is what they're getting. He's completely incapable of making any kind of coherent argument. And whenever he comes out to make an economic speech, he winds up talking about sharks and batteries and Hannibal Lecter. So he just kind of boots it down the road. And it's interesting. I'm curious what Ollie thinks. in some ways, I think she wasn't really running as herself in 2019, 2020, because the fight was all on the left. I think she came across as more progressive than she really was. She is a prosecutor. She was a pragmatic politician in California. So I think she's kind of back in her comfort zone. And yeah, she said a lot of things, in 2019, 2020 that she wasn't thrilled with, that people like Stuart and I aren't thrilled with. But she can also turn around and say, listen, I've been in office for 4 years. I've learned something. You can get these things done without these policies.
Although my values are the same.
Correct. My values are the same. I figured out practical ways of doing it. You have to work with the other side, blah, blah, blah. So yeah, in the hands of a more skilled politician, maybe she would be in trouble on some of these, but not this guy. He has just flubbed every opening and every opportunity.
Ali, can I add to your load, please? Because you're going to Erie, and, Pennsylvania is so important. And as they say, Pittsburgh to the west, Philadelphia to the east, Alabama in between. Last Friday, Politico came out with a big piece entitled The Pennsylvania Problem. This focuses on the Northeast and Lackawanna County, where Biden was really able to sell himself accurately as one of you. And, she doesn't have the same kind of cultural roots. So I wondered if I could blend into Jen's question the sense of how whether that's a real vulnerability for her and what she needs to do.
I think all of this speaks to the general question of who is Kamala Harris. And I remember in 2019 and 2020, this is a conversation I would have with sources both on other campaigns and then after when I was writing my book of people who worked with Harris both in the Senate and then on her campaign. There were just too many people at that point telling her who she needed to be. And that very much became clear to those of us who were on the campaign trail when it came to answering questions about her policy and what did she believe? Should private insurance remain in the system? Did you believe that it should still play a role? I mean, healthcare in and of itself could be an entire dissertation after the 2020 Democratic presidential primaries. But Harris is now defending the work that she's done of the last 4 years. She's tied to Biden, whether she likes it or not. But I think in places like Pennsylvania, that Biden persona, and I don't just mean Scranton Joe, but I mean the moderate and pragmatic approach that he pitched for the presidency, I think that's the kind of thing that allows them to build a broader coalition. And Stuart knows so well that campaigns are always trying to target, okay, well, what kinds of people are we targeting? And also where physically are they on the map? When I am going to Erie and when I'm going into all these other places, the groups of voters that I'm the most interested in are white women, actually, right now, in large part because it's the first presidential election in the post-Dobbs and post-Roe era. How are they responding to that? Polls are starting to show that the gender gap is changing, not in the ways that we typically see it change, where men are usually drivers of that gap because they become more conservative, but instead women could potentially be the changers and drivers of a difference in the gender gap this cycle because they are motivated by new issues and maybe they're turned off by Trump. I mean, I look at, for example, the little bit of movement that we might be seeing in polls right now, certainly among white women in the younger age group, 18 to 39, but older women who are feeling re-engaged right now on this question of abortion because in past elections, they thought it was settled. Now they're looking at their kids and grandkids and realizing that they might have less choice, less rights, less freedom than they did. And that's an energizing factor too. So we always talk about women in the suburbs and certainly in places like Georgia and North Carolina and Pennsylvania. All of that is going to be important because those are where the swing counties are anyway. But Kamala Harris has an opportunity to speak differently to them than Joe Biden ever could have, especially on the issue of reproductive freedom. And I think that's something Democrats really see as a selling point. And I mean, we'll ultimately see whether that's true or not, but I think it could be.
I would not be surprised on election night to see, I think she'll win Pennsylvania. I think she'll win it by more than Biden did. But I think the map is going to look different.
Yeah.
I think she's going to overperform what Biden did in the collar counties. And in the Lackawanna, she's probably going to underperform.
Stuart, what exactly is a collar county?
Oh, the counties that surround Philadelphia, which was the classic Republican, the heart of the Republican machine in Pennsylvania for decades. I mean, when I first started working there, I asked one of these county chairmen, like, how is it, they were predicting an exact vote they would deliver. I said, well, how do you know that you're going to get this vote? And he goes, buddy, around here, people still like their garbage picked up. So it was like an old machine that they had. And I think that the education divide is going to drive this so much because these are all college educated voters. She'll do better there. She's going to do better in Pittsburgh, which is really a tech center now. But all the votes, when you add it up, I think she'll end up better off than Biden.
I also think that the Harris campaign is doing something that Democrats haven't done for a long time, which is to shave their deficit in rural America. They don't have to win in those areas. They just have to make the gap slightly less bad. I had a really interesting conversation with a Democratic candidate for Senate in Florida, of all places. Why is that race as close as it is? Well, you can say Rick Scott is a crappy candidate, and he is a crappy candidate. And you could point to the homeowners insurance crisis, which is devastating and is going to be back on the map given the hurricane that they've had this week. But you know what is driving that? It is the abortion amendment that's on their ballot. And there are abortion amendments on lots of ballots, including places like Arizona. And that is a huge motivator for Democrats. And what the Democrat can say is the other guys are so extreme, so off the balance beam on this, that we're the reasonable ones. We're the ones who want to protect, and this is what Kamala Harris has absolutely done. We're the ones who are defending freedom. And that's a theme that Republicans like Stuart and I have been begging Democrats to do for years and years. Don't make this about choice. Don't make this about all of these other missions. This is freedom. This is the ability to decide for yourself how you want to live your life. Kamala Harris was very smart, very early on after Dobbs, in making this her kind of one-note message. She's continued it. I think it works really well. Every time there are one of these horror stories, like there was from ProPublica, these two women who died in Georgia because they were denied care, she gets another lift out of it. And I think it is resonating with a group I didn't expect to be that engaged with it. And that is a lot of men who have daughters, who have, sisters. She related a story of an older gentleman who came up and he said, "This is my number one issue." And she said, "Really?" This is a 70-year-old guy. His aunt had died in the pro-Roe era. So you're getting a connection to people's lives. And the way this guy put it to her, it was, this ruined an entire family. That's a powerful statement. And when you kind of multiply that out, it doesn't mean she's going to win a race. It doesn't mean that Kamala Harris is going to win in Florida, but it's going to be a lot closer than it was perhaps for Biden and for the last Senate race.
One layer deeper on Florida, because it is my ultimate favorite state to cover. And I got stuck there during the last recount when Rick Scott won the Senate bid last time, so multiple weeks in Tallahassee. But what Debbie Mucarsel-Powell has been trying to do, too, is speak directly to Hispanic and Latino communities in Florida to make the freedom case, and especially in various areas around Miami, Cubans who tend to skew conservative. But those messages around freedom can be particularly salient when messaged correctly to that group of voters. And the only other thing I would say, because I'm not entirely sure that I'm sold on the idea of Florida being flippable from a Senate perspective, but the DS, the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, is putting more money there. They're putting more money into Texas. Resources have been the issue for Democrats who are running in these down ballot races in Florida for the last two cycles. The fact that they're getting an influx of cash could be helpful. At least it could help them from a margins perspective. But Rick Scott has always won his races by like 1 point. They have always been razor thin. That's just what it was when he was in the governor's house. And then, of course, for the Senate bid as well.
And true confession, I just interviewed her last Wednesday. The piece just came out at the Washington Post, shameless plug. She said two things that were really interesting. One, her first ad was a Spanish language ad, which was really interesting. And the second thing she said is she's a Ecuadorian immigrant, came here when she was 14 years old, worked in a donut shop to help support her family. She said, "I am them. I know what it is to live under a dictatorship," she told me. That's pretty powerful stuff. And we tend to wrongly lump all Hispanic voters together. As Ali knows all too well, there are a lot of Venezuelans, Ecuadorians,
Puerto Ricans now around Jacksonville.
correct. And that makes a cultural point that Trump capitalized on last time. You remember he was talking about communists and socialists and all that kind of stuff? That was meant to put Democrats in the club with Fidel Castro. Well, she's kind of trying to reverse that. Now, I agree, Ali. I don't know if she's going to exactly make it, but the fact that they're spending money and now Republicans probably have to spend more money than they were planning on, and that they're not spending money elsewhere just tells you kind of how the race is going. And I think to some degree how much smarter Democrats have gotten in raising these issues and refining their message. I also got to say, she's the best candidate they've had there for a while. She's very dynamic. She's very charismatic. When she gets very worked up, her Spanish accent comes out just a little bit more, as it often does for those of us who grew up speaking a different language. And I think it's a connective. It's a way that she relates to those audiences.
Just a couple quick things. I'm really glad we did that, because so often on our podcast, we're talking nationally, and it feels to me like we should instead have a Florida week, a North Carolina week, a Pennsylvania week, etc.
Yo, sign me up for Florida week. That state is nuts.
But Ali used the big S word in her answer, the Senate. And as Steph Rule pointed out herself, those prospects seem to be dimming a bit for the Dems, and that would mean everything for economic policy. All right, let's go over now to the truth challenge, truth indifferent side of the campaign. So Trump last week accuses Harris of having lost, as in misplaced, 325,000 migrant children. They're either dead, being sold into sex slavery, or just plain missing. You know, Stuart, you were talking just a few minutes ago about why don't people call him on this? And, you know, we've been tearing our hair out about it for a matter of years. But are we at a point where, you know, he loses nothing by telling the craziest sort of lies because it's the music, not the words, and it comes across as tough on immigration in some way? And who cares that it's, you know, completely risible as a factual matter?
Look, I think Trump has this fundamental problem. He lost by 7 million. He needs new customers. And when he's doing this, he's not getting new customers. He's basically using lines that he uses at rallies to get him a good response. But this isn't expanding your base. It isn't expanding why people are going to vote for you. And in fact, unlike really any other campaign I've ever seen in my life, they're kind of daring people not to vote for him. Like the Nikki Haley voters. Like, we don't want you. And, you know, I think a lot of people are going to take him up on that. So I think the intensity of that MAGA vote is going to matter less than the intensity of the Democratic vote. And I think it's really important that Democrats do everything they can to drive up that intensity. And part of that is, I hope that they start transitioning to, we're going to win this race. You know, there's more of us than there are of them. I hope they can walk with a little swagger these last few weeks of this campaign, because that will attract voters. Usually the more confident campaign is something that people read. You don't want to seem cocky, but you want to say, you know, we are winning this race. I think it would really help them.
You know, it's interesting we're talking about kind of drilling down. There was a reason that Kamala Harris mentioned the several 100,000 Polish voters in Pennsylvania. We tend to think of these very familiar groups, women, college educated, but there are a lot of people of Eastern European origin in the upper Midwest and in the Rust Belt. And she is making a pitch to those people. And I think on Friday, when you saw Trump come out there with Zelensky and essentially, excuse my language, kiss Putin's ass and really try to embarrass Zelensky, and you combine that with Harris, who the day before had given this impassioned set of remarks appealing to him, she can take that, and her team can take that and focus an issue like that in areas in which you do have hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian, Poles, Eastern Europeans in critical swing states, we don't think of those people as a kind of a demographic unit, except in really close elections where 10,000 votes here or 10,000 votes there make a really big difference.
Yeah, in the 2004 Bush campaign, that was a real focus of ours because overwhelmingly those voters are Catholic too. And you're sort of getting a twofer there. But we did a lot of events then at these, Ukrainian meeting halls and Polish this and Czech that. And it worked because people appreciated being recognized and valued.
It's now time to take a moment for our sidebar feature, which explains some of the issues and relationships that are prominent in the news. Today, we're going to talk about the Freedom of Information Act, a juggernaut federal law that gives any member of the public power to get records from a federal agency, subject, however, to important exceptions. And to explain it, we are really pleased to welcome Reed Scott, an American actor best known for his roles in My Boys, the TBS comedy where he plays Brendan Branodorf, and for his role as Dan Egan in the great HBO series Veep. So I give you Reed Scott on the Freedom of Information Act.
What is the Freedom of Information Act? The Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA, is the law that lets individuals and the press obtain records of what the government is doing. These records can be anything from your grandfather's military discharge papers to a request from the New York Times for records about whom cabinet officials regularly meet with. Under the law, federal agencies must disclose requested information unless it is covered by one or more specific exemptions or exclusions. These include classified information, information related to law enforcement and criminal investigations, internal deliberations and privileged information, trade secrets, personal information of individuals, and, oddly enough, information about oil wells. FOIA applies to executive branch departments, agencies, and offices. Under FOIA, individuals can request any agency record, such as documents, photographs, videos, maps, email, and electronic records in the possession of the agency. The requester doesn't need any special form of magic words, just a reasonable written description of the records sought. An agency must produce any responsive documents not subject to an exemption or exclusion. However, the agency is allowed to charge reasonable costs for searching in producing the documents. Most federal agency websites have information on how to make a request. Agencies sometimes refuse to produce records in response to even valid requests. For example, they may rely on an overly expansive view of an exception to disclosure, or they may wrongly claim that they have no responsive records. When that happens, FOIA empowers the requester to file an administrative appeal and then to sue the government to force it to respond properly. FOIA requests are typically processed quickly. The default time is 20 working days or about 1 month. That can be extended for complex requests and also expedited for certain urgent ones. FOIA requests and litigation can produce powerful information about the workings of the government. For Talking Feds, I'm Reed Scott.
All right, it is now time for a spirited debate brought to you by our sponsor, Total Wine and More. Each episode, you'll be hearing an expert talk about the pros and cons of a particular issue in the world of wine, spirit, and beverages.
Thank you, Harry. In today's spirited debate, Bordeaux and Napa face off, pitting the Bordeaux Reds against the California Cabs. From a numbers standpoint, the Bordeaux region is the clear winner, with more wineries and higher production of bottles, producing nearly 6.5 times more wine than Napa. But more doesn't necessarily mean better. Bordeaux wines are a blend of 5 different grapes. The Bordeaux region is actually divided by an estuary and 2 rivers forming the left bank and the right bank. Left bank wines are predominantly Cabernet Sauvignon based, featuring more tannins and bigger overall structure. Right bank wines are predominantly Merlot based, richer in fruit, with a softer mouthfeel and less tannin and acidity. Now, much like the left bank, Napa wines are predominantly Cabernet Sauvignon. and well known for their rich, bold style. Many of these wines are also blends, but you can also find 100% varietal wines from Napa. So whether you're Team Bordeaux or Team Napa, your local Total Wine & More has a huge selection, so you can enjoy the best of both worlds at a price that won't break the left or right bank. So find what you love and love what you find, only at Total Wine & More. Cheers!
Thanks to our friends at Total Wine & More for today's A Spirited Debate. Let me go to another thing that he's gotten a pass on so far, but the whispers get louder. Will somebody, maybe surrogates, maybe Walz in the coming debate, make a point of Biden took such an onslaught for months about supposed mental decline? Any kind of extended talk by Trump is just, word salad. Did you hear his Dadaist patter about San Francisco? It's not just, he's got this sort of obsessive quality of an old senile guy going back to his complaints, and he's still talking about the debate. Do you see that as something that people are going to try to showcase on the left, if not Harris and Walz themselves, given that it certainly was showcased on the right as to Biden before he got out of the race?
Maybe. I mean, Stuart looks so happy by this topic. I'll only speak briefly and then throw it to him. But look, I think if it's Harris and Walz, sure, fine. But I think they've found a little bit more efficacy with this idea of him being both weird and dangerous, that they may not need to veer into this, especially because there are Republicans or former Republicans or disillusioned Republicans who are happy to make this point about the call coming from inside the House on Trump's mental acuity. And so I don't think that Harris and Walz themselves necessarily need to make it. When I do think about the attacks that Walz might lob, I actually think less about that VP debate from that perspective and more about the perspective of what is J.D. Vance going to say on that stage that Trump then at a rally or in an interview completely cuts the knees out from under and says, well, he doesn't speak for me, because he's done it on a variety of topics. And that lack of cohesion on a ticket just tends to lend to this idea of like, what is the tension? Why am I feeling uneasy about this partnership? And like, if reporters are sensing that, then certainly voters probably will too.
This is an issue, Harry, that I have beaten my head against the wall for well over a year, that the press has somehow not been able to convey the sheer craziness, the unhingedness, the mental breakdown of Trump. There are some practical reasons for this. You don't want to run 2 minutes of tape on a segment of blather because people get confused. You don't want to run him live because he's constantly lying. So when you have a video piece or in a written piece, you try to pull out like the coherent 5 lines to try to explain what you think he was saying. All that winds up as normalizing him and making him seem much more cogent than he really is. I will say something, though. I don't take credit for this. I think there are a lot of people who have been hammering at this. Look at the New York Times on Friday. There was finally a piece in real detail describing how disjointed, how crazy Trump was going to be. Hallelujah. After all of these months, finally, we get a specific explanation of what is in front of their faces. And I think the excuse that this is kind of baked in, everybody knows it. Yeah, that's true. But that's really not the press's job. The press's job is to report kind of what's there and let voters decide whether they knew it before or not. But I also think at this point, it does kind of speak for itself. When Biden was there, you couldn't really make this argument effectively as a way of distinguishing the candidates. And in journalism, as in politics, it's about distinctions. Now, the distinction is so obvious. It is so apparent that she is cogent and young and energetic and can complete an English sentence that I think voters kind of are getting there. Whether the press could have done a better job up to now or not, we're going to argue about that for a long time. But frankly, that's one of the reasons that, he bombed in the debate. He was a crazy old man.
Yeah. The other thing that I don't think we talk enough about it is race in this race, and how I think you can make a good case that the entire campaign is about race. Trump's coalition was 85% white in a country that's 59% white. You had this spectacle of, at a Republican rally, they were chanting, "Send them back," which when I grew up in Mississippi, that was Klan rally stuff. And I think it's just extraordinary that this has somehow been normalized enough. And we don't talk about it. We say, Trump does well with evangelicals. If they're white, black evangelicals are like 98% against him. They say, well, Trump wins the working class, only if they're white. Now, this is more of a Republican this existed before Trump. But we always thought that it was a problem. Trump has seen it as an opportunity to drive racism. And I think that it's something about that bothers these college-educated voters. And it's not the way that they want to see himself. And I think Trump has made this bet that is about an America that doesn't exist anymore. Talking about suburbs who might be frightened by someone moving in next door with a different race or a different religion. I think most people in the suburbs would go out of their way to be welcoming, to show their kids this is where you're supposed to be. You take your average teenager in Mississippi, they'd rather be a black rap star than Robert E. Lee. And that world is just over. And it's part of this mythical past that he's trapped in.
But this idea of the other has always been central to Trumpism, right? When I was out there on the campaign trail in 2015, I remember sitting on a press riser in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, the night that he unveiled the Muslim ban. Race and otherization were central to that idea. You carry that thread then, you bring it all the way through to right now. They're killing the dogs and cats in Springfield. I mean, that entire idea of mythical thinking that is not founded in reality against Haitian immigrants in a small Ohio area is the through line. Otherizing. They're not from here. They're not of us. This mythical America that he thinks of. It's always been the central feature.
It is fascism. I mean, this is kind of the basis of it. When he says, I'm going to blame Jews if I don't win, I mean, my hair stands up on the back of my neck. That is what he does. That goes back to they're sending us murderers and rapists. That's what he has always been. That is why he refuses to condemn the Proud Boys. And while there are very fine people on both sides, he is playing into that noxious underbelly of white resentment and white supremacy. My friend Sarah Longwell gave the perfect analogy. She said he's picked up the manhole cover and the sewer rats have run out. And that was so telling. He has made it acceptable to make these kinds of arguments and to make these kinds of appeals. And when the Republican Party gets around to fixing itself, if it does, there's going to have to be a lot of soul searching about how they come to terms with this. And, they're running out of white people to win elections. And sooner or later, they're going to have to confront the fact that America is a diverse democracy. And you can't keep doing this and hope to win political power.
If you're 16 years or younger in America, the majority are non-white. And the odds are looking really good they're going to be non-white when they turn 18. And that's the world that the Republicans are afraid of, which is why they're trying to curate the vote so desperately. Because either they have to change what they're incapable of, or they're just going to lose elections.
The finer point that I would put on something that you just said, Jen, is this idea of there's a big difference, I think, between the white supremacist thread that we often talk about here and the white resentment thread. Because I remember in the early days of trying to explain what this mass Trump appeal was, this idea of resentment, of being forgotten, of being left behind was something I heard so consistently from voters. And that's an idea, I think, that's really powerful. It's really motivating. It's fear-based, right? And someone who will amplify and play on fear is certainly an energizer to the polls. But I deeply understood the people that I met who were worried about the future of their jobs, the future of their communities, especially in areas through the industrial Midwest where there is this general feeling among voters that I would talk to there of being left behind somehow. And so Trump spoke to that. We were talking earlier about the ways in which it's important to make voters feel seen. That has always been very central to the way that Trump speaks to these people. And it's why he's been able to keep that MAGA coalition so intact. And I just think it's a distinction that's kind of important.
When you come down to it, that's why he's been able to play fast and loose, for example, with abortion. He doesn't give a damn about abortion. He constantly steps in it because he doesn't really know what his position is or should be or what's going to appeal to his followers or not. The one thing he never steps back on is immigration, race, resentment, this Christians are in peril kind of phenomenon. That is central to what he is. And it is a walking, talking advertisement for what has happened to the Republican Party, which has become a white, older, more rural, more Christian party. And that's who he is appealing to.
This is my great frustration with the coverage of Trump, that there is a reluctance to call Trump supporters racist that I don't understand. Sending all these journalists to these diners in Ohio to talk to Trump voters, to me, is like sending the best journalist in America to strip clubs to figure out why men go to strip clubs. I think we know. And it's some reason that we just can't say this. And all of those people, if you go back and you read the coverage of David Duke in Louisiana, it was all about economic anxiety. That's all the coverage was. It hasn't changed at all. And Trump's best group is those who make over $100,000 a year. And I run into this all the time with my old Republican friends. They say, so, Stuart, you think all these people who vote for Trump are racist? I go, no, but you have to admit it to yourself that there's something more important to you than having a racist as president, because you can't deny that Trump is a racist. And that has been embraced by the party. And that really has never happened before. And I think it's just part of this complete collapse of the party.
I think this is all so dead on, and where I think historians will tend to settle. I just want to make a couple follow-up points. First, I couldn't agree more with what everybody was saying. Jen, to your point, we shy away, and and I do purposely, from strict analogies or with Hitler or Mussolini, but it's totally important and compelling and true to point out this one feature of a sort of sympathetic appeal to people who feel, against the other, to people who feel economically left out. And the second point I wanted to raise was to Stuart's, which is the burning question here has always been, where the hell is the Republican Party? Why have they permitted this, knowing that he's lying right, left, and center, not liking him? And a very compelling explanation of this, I think, is by Steve Levitsky at Harvard, who basically made the point you just said, that this is an existential problem for Republicans. It's not like another election where maybe we fight hard, maybe we lose, and we are back in 4 years. With the demographic changing there, it's getting less and less tenable to try to hang on to with a popular vote minority through the operation of the Electoral College, and sort of everything's at stake. And that's maybe why you see this really shameful behavior of kind of enabling him. And the Springfield point, Ali, finally, it's like, it says so much. He's getting pilloried. Everyone knows, why does he want to keep talking about eating pets and the like, which everyone knows is false. And I do think it's just some way of keeping immigration there. At the debate, for example, when he was really knocked off his balance repeatedly, he just kept coming back to immigration. It's like a boxer who's sort of out on his feet and, does whatever they do instinctually, just immigration as the other.
There's a fundamental question here. Did Trump change the Republican Party or reveal the Republican Party? I come down on he revealed the Republican Party side. If you look at what were the central bedrock values of the Republican Party, character counts, strong on the Soviet Union, strong on communism, the deficit, personal responsibility. We would say we have different policies, but we believe in these principles. And Trump, it's not like he drifted away from them. He's against each of those. So do you abandon deeply held beliefs in a couple of years? I don't think you do. I think it just means that you didn't deeply hold them. And a lot of us feel like somebody who was working for Bernie Madoff actually thought we were beating the market, because we believed this stuff. And as it turned out, the majority of the party, including the people that we were working to elect, most of them, they were just marketing slogans. They didn't mean anything.
It seems that from flirting with it, the treatment of Zelensky, as Jen said, and what happened at the rally where Trump faithful applauded the very mention of the name Vladimir Putin. Is MAGA now gone all Putin, all Russia? And is that a fundamental foreign policy tenet?
Look, I think there's two things at work here. One is, and we don't talk enough about this, the Russians helped elect Trump. Trump won. What did the Russians get? Well, it turns out they got more than they ever could have dreamed of. And they may, as a result of this, get the second largest country in Europe. It's extraordinary. And the degree to which Russian influence has compromised the Republican Party, I think, is one of the great stories of our time that hasn't been told enough. You go to the NRA, it's pretty much everywhere. But the other aspect of this is, these Republicans, a lot of them look at what they think Russia is, and they like it. There's nothing but white men in charge. There's no gays in Russia. I mean, we know that. They say that they're all Christians, which is insane, but they do. And elections are performative but not decisive. And they go, tell me that's not what these people want. And it's very telling and goes to this Republican Party is at war with the modern world, that it can't adjust. This is how you get in the fight with Disney, the happiness company. You get in the fight with Nike over Colin Kaepernick. What happens? Nike makes $9 billion. It's the wrong thing. Remember they got in a fight with NASCAR when NASCAR banned the Confederate flag? You know, you're on the wrong side of a culture war with NASCAR and you're a Republican? I mean, it's just this rejection of the world that we live in. And I think this whole obsession with trans is because so many Republicans never accepted same-sex marriage. They just shut up about it. And this is a way to sort of claw that back, some of the anger about it. And it's not what's going to happen. You know, one of my favorite clients and old friends was Haley Barber in Mississippi. And Haley had this saying, he said, be for the future. It's going to happen anyway. And that's something the Republican Party has forgotten.
When I saw that, chanting for Putin, I could only think of that big meeting at Madison Square Gardens in the 1930s that the German Bund held. That was this adulation of Hitler.
A great movie about that, A Night at the Garden by Marshall Curry.
Yeah, and Stuart's right. The whole strongman fetish, the white Christianity, the ability to squash your opponents, the ability to literally and figuratively roll over your enemies. This is what they aspire to. This is kind of an ideal. And it is frightful, but I think it's also unsustainable. Stuart's right. This is like the last election they could possibly, pull off with this. The demographics, the mood of the country will not sustain this. And maybe it's because I gave a speech last week at Gettysburg College. But when I go, I always go with one of their graduate students out on the battlefield. And at the very end, standing on the edge of the field that Pickett's charge, went over. And in back of us is this gigantic statue of Robert E. Lee. It's so tall, you can't even see Lee's face at the top. They have never given that up. The deification of Lee, the lost cause, the sense that there was this mythical, wonderful world in which men were men, women were women. There was some kind of bizarre code of chivalry and honor. It is still there. And I'm not to say that these people are in favor of slavery, but it's a mentality, an outlook that is at war with everything that came after the Civil War, everything that has to do with a pluralistic democracy. And we can't, confuse ourselves. We can't shut our eyes to this. You have to defeat this. What they want, you cannot give them. You cannot give them a white supremacist state.
As a seventh generation Mississippian named for Jeb Stuart, I will take the stand as an expert witness and say you're absolutely right. It is the lost cause.
This is another fabulous point. I just want to underscore, people have been disparaging it for a while, but you're really staking a point on that this is, an unsustainable kind of quasi-romantic attachment to a past that is slipping by the day, and that's got political import as well. This has really been a fabulous discussion, I want to say. We're just about out of time. We have a minute left for our final feature of 5 words or fewer, where we take a question from a listener. Each of us has to answer in 5 words or fewer. So Trump continues to be and will be peppered with questions about Mark Robinson. This week, his response was, "I don't know the situation." I think the listener here is betting that won't hold. He'll be asked again, especially because North Carolina is a battleground state. So what will his next response be?
He was only getting coffee.
I stand by Mark Robinson.
This isn't my business.
And I'm going with good people on both sides. Thank you so much, Jen, Stuart, and Ali. And thank you very much, listeners, for tuning in to Talking Feds. If you like what you've heard, please tell a friend to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever they get their podcasts. And please take a moment to rate and review this podcast. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where we are posting full episodes, talking books, and bonus video content. You can follow us on Twitter at Talking Feds Pod, and you can look to see our latest offerings on Patreon. Talking Feds remains a completely independent production, so if you like the work we do and are inclined to support the show, joining our Patreon is the best way to do it, and it will give you access to a passel of exclusive material available only to Patreon members. Thanks for tuning in, and don't worry, as long as you need answers, the Feds will keep talking. Talking Feds is produced by Catherine Devine, associate producer Gabriella Glick, sound engineering by Matt McCardle. Rosie Dawn Griffin, Hamza Mahendranathan, David Lieberman, and Emma Maynard are our contributing writers. Production assistance by Akshaj Turbailu and Sebastian Navarro. Thanks very much to the great Reed Scott for explaining the Freedom of Information Act. Our music, as always, is by the amazing Philip Glass. And finally, to those who observe the Jewish holidays, Shana Tova. Talking Feds is a production of Delito LLC. I'm Harry Littman. Talk to you later.